Gambling policy continues to be front and center for the NFL. And I think we've now reached the end of what I'll call phase one of gambling policy enforcement. Because now that we've had 10 total players who have been suspended for violating the gambling policy, 7 for betting on pro football, the other 3 for betting on other sports while at work, even if it was reportedly for Jamison Williams of the Lions in a hotel while on the road. 10 players, going back to Calvin Ridley, have been suspended. At this point, no player in the NFL can say, I don't know and didn't know there's a rule regarding gambling. They should all know at this point. Now, do they truly know the contours? Do they understand what they can and can't do? Do they accept and submit to the rule? That's another issue. But let's assume they all know what the rule is. They're all in a position where they have the resources available to them. When in doubt, ask someone a question. I was curious, for example, in the aftermath of last night's golf event with Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes taking on Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, the match. I asked the NFL, hey, just to be clear, is this something that players would have been allowed to bet on? It involves NFL players. Well, players can bet on it. It's only when it's an NFL event. Games, obviously. Draft picks, who's going to be drafted where. Pro Bowl games are part of it. If anyone's betting on who runs through the obstacle course faster. Honors at the end of the season. Who's the MVP, who's the offensive player of the year, etc. But if it's NFL players involved in non-NFL events, it's fair game. Now, presumably, if the NFL would ever decide to have some late June phony competition golf match or 2-on-2 basketball or whatever, that would make it an NFL event, presumably. But that's kind of where the rubber meets the road here, and it's important that the players understand. And I've suggested maybe a hotline where any player could contact, either by voice or by text or email even, a joint NFL-NFLPA service that would tell them whether or not a proposed bet is proper. That would be the best and most effective way if the players would use it. But at this point, because I think to this point, the league has done a poor job of educating players. Teams have not, in some cases, properly supplemented what the league has done. I believe the league's motivation has been to get signatures on acknowledgement forms, not make sure the players truly understand the rule. I think the league has been bogged down by the hypocrisy of stuffing their pockets full of money from sportsbook sponsorships and allowing owners to hold equity in sportsbook companies. They understand they're in a difficult spot. It impairs their ability to give that full-throated, this is what you are prohibited from doing. And I still would submit that the best outcome for the NFL would be to have an epiphany here, that we don't need the gambling money. Things are fine. We're making ends meet without grabbing more money for nothing from associating our logos and names with sportsbook companies. We're fine there. We're going to slam the door on gambling. We're going to build a firewall because it's going to make it easier for us to have the moral authority to go to the players and say, you can't bet on anything. On anything. No gambling on sports until your career is over, period. It's easier to do that if the NFL can also say we are making not a single penny, directly or indirectly, from gambling. If they would do that, it would go a long way toward making it easier for them to have that ability without issues of hypocrisy and inconsistency and fairness dragging down the NFL's effort. And that leads to the comment that was made last night by Jonathan Jones of the Patriots. Jonathan Jones said on Twitter, I understand rules are rules, but I can risk my life so that my team wins, but I can't risk $1,000 on my team winning. And I got to thinking, and look, part of what I'm doing here is trying to just demonstrate how ridiculous and inconsistent this all is and how hard it is for the NFL to have that true moral authority to enforce its own rules. But if this entire ban on gambling flows from a desire to preserve and protect the integrity of the game, what about betting on your team to win affects the integrity of the game. You play to win the game, as Herm Edwards once famously said. Every team is trying to win every game, every time. The NFL tells us that when the question of tanking comes up. Everybody's always trying to win. Winning, 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 winning. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Now, preseason, that's a different issue, and I would not endorse any conversation about players betting on their teams to win in the preseason. I'm talking about regular season and postseason, and not point spread bets. Because if you're favored to win by 10 and your team's up by 7 late, and you've got guys who bet on their team giving 10, and the coach all of a sudden says, take an E, and the players are like, we'd like to score 4 more points here. That's a problem. But a straight money line wager, Patriots to win. What about a Patriots to win bet affects the integrity of the game for a Patriots player who is already trying to win the game? And it's amazing how many people have lost their minds about this argument. It's a very simple argument, and it's rooted in common sense. They are already playing to win the game. What undermines the integrity of the game if you allow a player who is participating in the game, who is already trying to win the game, to bet on his team winning the game? How does it affect the integrity of anything? And I raise this point because it just demonstrates the flaws in the logic, the flaws in the thinking, the flaws in the approach. Because there is no impact on the integrity of the game. And you get a lot of, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about this? Well, given that Big Brother that everyone is carrying around is the thing that provides the real-time evidence to the NFL about who is and who isn't, and it may not be happening in real time, but ultimately it is the evidence about who's betting on other sports at work, who's betting on NFL games anywhere. If you allow the players who are on a given team to make a money line wager on that team to win, you know it, you track it, you see it. The sports books see it. Anything beyond that, you're violating the policy. You're getting dangerously close to the line, but you can't do anything more than that. You can do that, but you can't do anything else. And when you look at some of the things that Roger Goodell said back in 2009 when the NFL was fighting tooth and nail against Delaware's effort to take down the federal law that ultimately was taken down by New Jersey 8 years later, that opened the floodgates for state-by-state legalized wagering programs, there's nothing in his comments that would say it's an affront to the integrity of the game for a player who is playing on a team that's trying to win to bet on his team to win as a money line proposition. Nothing else would be allowed, but that should be fine. People have said, well, they have access to inside information. What is the inside information if you're betting on your team to win the game as a money line wager? What's the inside information? Hey, guys, I got a secret plan for this week's game. Here it is. Don't tell anybody. We're going to try to score more points than the other team. Shh. That's the plan. There's no inside information in that. They're trying to win the game. They want to score more points than the other team. Well, a player making a bet would show that he has more confidence. The point is this. This whole thing is rife with hypocrisy. The NFL is finding a way to talk out of both sides of its mouth. Do as we say, not as we do. And I think examples like this demonstrate that the right thing for the league to do is just build that firewall and say, we're not taking the money. We're not going to let owners have equity interest in sports books. They're going to have to divest, or they're going to have to sell their teams. Remember, the Rooneys went through that 15 years ago or thereabouts, where their legal gambling interests that were permissible under league rules began to stray beyond what the league allowed. And the league said, hey, you got to make a choice here. You got to divest or you got to sell. And the league was, and I remember other teams were very upset that the league was way too patient with the Rooneys, waited way too long to force the Rooneys to fix this. Eventually, members of the Rooney family got out of the Steelers business and stayed in the gambling that violated the gambling policy at the time, whether it was slot machines, video lottery, video poker, whatever. There was something that was being added to their legal, within the eyes of the NFL, gambling interests that crossed the line, and the league eventually forced the Rooney's hand, and some of the Rooneys chose the gambling over owning the team. So my point is this: for sports wagering, the only way that the NFL can send a clear and obvious message to the players that they should not do it. And I submit that the rule should be players should not be betting on any sports whatsoever, just like non-players. I still don't know why players are allowed to do it. It's not collectively bargained. The league just decided to let them do it. Why? Is the Chris Sims theory accurate that the sports books just want some whales, some young rich guys with a lot of disposable income and some free time on their hands 6 months out of the year, where they're sitting at home watching basketball? Hey, DraftKings app, FanDuel app, boom, 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 drop 1,000, drop 5,000, drop 10,000, whatever. Is that why players are allowed to bet on other sports? To help the sports books make some of the money back that they're giving to the NFL? Wouldn't it be better for everyone if the rule was players just can't bet on sports? It would be nice to have someone answer that question. Why? And I don't know that I've specifically asked the league that question. I think I'm going to. Why are players, how did this happen? That players in the NFL's exercise of its unilateral power under the management rights clause via the integrity of the game, gambling policy, the union just sits back and says, it's fine. No bargaining necessary. Do whatever you want. Why did the NFL decide to let players bet on other sports when non-players can't? Anyway, this all becomes cleaner and clearer and easier for everyone if the league would just say, we're out of the gambling business altogether. The problem is the league is trying to have it both ways. Now, if we have completed phase one of the NFL's coexistence with gambling, and players now fully know, they should have known a long time ago, but now they fully know what the policy is, what it allows, what it doesn't. Let's assume they all know. What's phase two? I've got some ideas as to what phase two could be, whether it's phase two, phase three, phase four. A next phase will be, what do you do about the guys who arrive in the NFL with a gambling addiction? What do you do about those guys? Guys who, from the moment they turned 18, or whatever the minimum age is, I assume it's 18, and started gambling on their phones. They developed an addiction in college, the college regulatory process. And I don't know what the rules are for college players. Can they bet on NFL games? I don't know. It's not my jurisdiction. I'm curious about it now. Are NCAA players allowed to legally wager on NFL games while they're in college playing college football? If they are, and there'd be no reason for them not to be, they develop an addiction to gambling on the NFL, and then they arrive in the NFL. What do you do? How do you help those kids? Do you try to identify them in advance and help them and give them treatment? Or do you just wait for them to screw up and hold up their head as the latest example of what happens when you run afoul of the gambling rules? So that's an issue. How do they deal with addiction? Another issue, and this is an example of how it becomes much harder for the NFL to enforce its policies when the evidence isn't just falling into its lap. The 10 suspensions they've imposed, my assumption based upon everything I've seen and heard is that all of that evidence came straight from the sports books. NFL just sits back. The sports books blow the whistle. And I've had people say, well, how is this fair? How is this proper? How are they allowed to do it? I think the regulatory bodies have some say in it. I think there is some obligation out there in situations like this where you have people who are subject to these kinds of rules. If they're betting, the information has to be made available. And that's another thing that we now know. Your phone will rat you out. FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM will rat you out. They presumably can do so legally. But now that we know that you can't use this thing to bet on the NFL, you can't use this thing to bet on other sports when you're at work, The smart guys will find other people to bet for them. What will the NFL ever do to investigate and enforce that? Isn't that easy? Spouse, girlfriend, friend, associate, cousin, uncle, family member, a guy that the player just happens to meet somewhere and strike up a conversation with and say, hey, you'd like to make a little extra money? Place these bets for me. I'll give you the cash. You make the bets. You get to keep X percentage of the winnings. What do they do to spot that guy who's smart enough to beat the current system? Because you have to worry about that. See, my opinion has been that the NFL kind of likes that these suspensions are happening because it allows the NFL to create the impression for the world that their policy works because they're catching guys who violate it. And again, what effort does it take? The challenge is spotting the guys who are smart enough to not bet on their own phones in their own names and who set up someone else to do it for them. Remember when, and Ross Tucker recently reminded me of this, because there's been thought of, a more aggressive effort via what used to be the rookie symposium to make sure the incoming players understand gambling properly and what they can and can't do. Remember when Chris Carter mentioned that everyone needs to have a fall guy? I mean, that becomes your gambling fall guy. You find someone else who isn't subject to the gambling policy who's allowed to do it. It's not even a fall guy. There's no one to fall. There's nothing to trip over. It's perfectly legal for someone other than the player to make those bets. It's against the policy for the player to be financing those bets and collecting the winnings. What will the NFL do to prevent that from happening? Because you know what? And hey, if I'm going to be one of Howie Roseman's top 5 NFL conspiracy theorists, I have to continue to hold my position. I would suspect that's already happening. Wouldn't you? Do you want a spot in the top 5 with me? Wouldn't you believe that already smart players are using other people to make their bets? Wouldn't you believe that's happening? Wouldn't you believe that some smart non-players are using other people to make their bets? It's an easy fix. If you're smart, if you're discreet, if you use a burner phone, how are they ever going to prove it? How are they ever going to begin to have the resources in place to prove it? What are they going to do? I mean, it's one thing to have FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, et cetera, just hand you the information of the guys who have violated the policy. It's another thing to track down people's phones, digital footprints, and who they know and who they're talking to. The other issue, too, that we now see from the Isaiah Rodgers suspension, the report that one of his wagers was $1,000 on a teammate's over-under for rushing yards. We assume, I don't know, I don't assume anything in this setting. The guy either bet over or under. Oh, don't you believe in your teammate? You bet the over if you believe in your teammate. Well, it's not a matter of believing in the teammate or not believing in the teammate. It's a matter of knowing what the game plan is. It has nothing to do with the ability of the player. It has everything to do with the opportunities the player will get in that game and Isaiah Rodgers' knowledge of those opportunities from being in practice all week, from having access to the game plan, the meetings, the discussions, the conversations. If you're part of that bubble, there's a lot of stuff you know. Now, Isaiah Rodgers foolishly used it for his own wager. One of the next frontiers for the NFL as it relates to gambling is what systems do you put in place to ensure that inside information is being properly handled and to catch those who are mishandling it. Think of all the information that is available to a player over the course of a week, of all the meetings, all the practices, the game plans, the film study, everything. By the end of the week, the night before the game, that player has a wealth of information that could be tapped into by anyone. How many players currently are actively supplying inside information to others for money? I don't know. Are there any? Does it take a top 5 conspiracy theorist to at least consider maybe there are players out there who aren't betting, have no desire to bet, but they have in their possession a marketable asset, material, non-public information regarding their team's plans for the next game. And it can be anything. It could be anything. The teams that script the first 15 plays, who knows those? Just the general approach that week. We're going to go run heavy. We're going to go pass heavy. Our defense is going to focus on taking away the run. They're going to be able to pass. Our defense is going to focus on taking away the pass. They're going to be able to run. It can be an entire universe of information. You can have a player who has a contact who that player calls the night before every game and just downloads everything he knows. Do you think that's already happening? I don't know, but I think it will. May not be happening now, but I think it will. And I think the NFL had better be concerned about it. Because what I'm trying to do is identify the potential pitfalls, the things that could happen that could crash the NFL. Not completely, but just diminish it. You don't need. Now, look, short term, would we benefit as an outlet that covers the NFL from a Tim Donaghy type scandal? You bet. Long term, does it help the NFL if there's a scandal like that? And I mentioned Tim Donaghy just because that resonates. We immediately think NBA officiating scandal. Do we want there to be a name that is forever associated with that scandal or this scandal or that scandal? And it's not just point shaving. It's not just fixing games. I think that's harder to do in the NFL. And the NFL has reconciled itself with that reality. But inside information, selling it, using it, abusing it, NFL needs to be very concerned about that.
Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.